There are stories that are never spoken out loud, not because they are too small, but because they are too personal, too silent for anyone to dare touch. This is the story of two women, a mother and her daughter, who both walked through two wars, carrying within them a past that could never be named. There is no clear ending, no complete forgiveness, only love surviving the silence, gently reminding us in the end that sometimes the only thing left between two people is the unbreakable thread called mother and child. Some photographs are never placed in frames, and some memories are never spoken aloud. Years after Audrey Hepburn had become a shining name in Hollywood, there was a photo that remained hidden in the drawer of her old bookshelf. A black and white photo faded with time. In it stood her mother, Baroness Ella von Heemstra, shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. Her face radiated reverence, and Hitler, as if holding the hand of a noblewoman, bowing to a deeply mistaken history. Audrey first saw the photo as a young girl. She didn't ask. She didn't scream. She didn't question. She simply remained silent, as though instinctively sensing that her mother had walked a path she herself could never follow. Ella, Audrey's mother, was a woman of severe beauty, elegance, and commanding presence. She once lived among the formal tea parties of Brussels, believing in order, in the dignity of nobility, in the kind of stability that sometimes only authoritarianism could promise. When World War I shook the world, Ella was still a girl. But by the time the Second War approached, she had become a mother and a woman standing at the fragile boundary between conviction and guilt. To Audrey, her mother was never like other mothers. There were no soft embraces, no lullabies, no bedtime stories whispered in the dark. Instead, there was order, discipline, and an unyielding belief that weakness kills a child more surely than war. And perhaps she truly believed it. Audrey grew up in a home that lacked for nothing except something she could never quite name. Perhaps it was a gentle hand brushing her hair at night, or a simple compliment after her first ballet recital. The only thing she ever received from her mother was a cold, unwavering gaze filled with expectations to be strong, dignified, and never bring shame to the family name. In 1939, war knocked on their door. Audrey and her mother returned to the Netherlands, believing it would be a haven. But within a year, German troops invaded and occupied the entire country. Ella had once believed Hitler would bring order to Europe, but she soon began to see the shadows behind that order. Shadows of people being taken away, of women dragged from their homes in the night, of boys vanishing without a trace. Audrey was just 11, and the world she once knew disappeared overnight. War did not knock politely. It walked straight into the kitchen, into bedrooms, into a child's dreams. In those first days of invasion, Audrey watched convoys of Jews pass through town. Her eyes met those of a girl her own age, clinging tightly to her mother's hand. No tears, just a look no one forgets. But in that darkness, something shifted. Ella quietly withdrew her praise of Hitler. She removed the photo from her desk. She stopped attending tea parties with Nazi sympathizers. She became quiet. And in that silence, something between mother and daughter began to rewrite itself. Not with words, but in the way they coexisted in a house with no heat during winters, with no bread. Years later, as a UNICEF ambassador, Audrey once said, "War taught me that silence is sometimes the only language left." Perhaps she wasn't only talking about bombs. Perhaps she was talking about her mother. Some photographs are never hung, but sometimes the things we don't display are what anchor us the most. Some mothers are born to embrace, others are shaped to endure. Ella van Heemstra belonged to the latter. In the old house in Brussels where Audrey spent her earliest years, everything had its place. From the napkins to the hair ribbons, from the flower vase to the slippers by the bed. All reflected a woman who believed order was the last thing left for people to control. And if her daughter was to survive, she had to learn it too. But how could a 4-year-old understand why she wasn't allowed to cry when she scraped her knee, or why every time she ran into her mother's arms, she was gently pushed away with a stern look, as if affection was a burden? Audrey couldn't recall exactly when she learned that. She only knew that over time she stopped crying, stopped asking for hugs, and learned to stand the straight smile even when her heart wanted to fall apart. Ella wasn't cruel. She was afraid that the world would devour her daughter if she were too soft, afraid that too much love would soften the parts that needed to be tough. She believed affection must be restrained so the child won't depend on it. Audrey loved her mother with a quiet, aching kind of love. She longed for tenderness, the kind she saw other mothers give their children: a stroke of hair, a fairy tale before bed, a sneaky extra cookie in the lunchbox. But she learned to live without it. In its place were long ballet practices that left her exhausted, constant reminders about posture poise, and one phrase that echoed over and over: hold your head high. A strong woman never bows even when her heart is heavy. One night when Audrey was sick, she came down with a fever. Lying in bed, trembling, lips parched, Ella came in, placed a hand on her forehead. But then she just stood there silent. No kiss, no whispered, "I'm here." Just a long gaze, then a turn, and quiet steps out of the room. And in that retreating footstep, Audrey heard something deeper than words. Her mother didn't know what to do with pain she couldn't see. Growing up in that chill, Audrey didn't become cold like her mother hoped. Instead, she became strangely sensitive. She noticed the smallest tremble in someone's voice. She sensed sorrow in a stranger's eyes. She learned to stay silent when others needed it, and to hold a hand without being asked. From the void of maternal warmth, she built her own form of gentleness, fragile but stronger than discipline. Audrey never blamed her mother, but she never said thank you either. Their love was unnamed. Not warmth, not exactly distance. It was a glue made of duty, responsibility, and a loneliness neither dared touch. Years later, as a mother herself, Audrey held her son tightly for long moments. She once said when Luca fell asleep on her chest, she cried not from sentiment, but because for the first time she understood what a mother was meant to be. And in that moment, she thought of her own. A tall woman proud in her stride who had lived a whole life never learning how to hug a child who simply needed love. Childhood is the most fragile thing. It's not built from stone, but from memories as light as petals. And precisely for that reason, it shatters more easily than anything else. When Audrey was just 11, war entered her life like an icy gust that blew the door of childhood wide open. In 1940, German troops marched into the Netherlands. In Velp, the small village where Audrey and her mother had taken refuge, locals lined the streets holding their breath as military convoys poured across their homeland like cold blood through veins. Audrey had thought war was something distant, something out of history books where generals argued over maps. But then she saw war doesn't need maps. It was in her mother's terrified eyes at the first sound of falling bombs. It was in the gunfire echoing from the forest, and in the words swallowed greetings, silenced as neighbors were dragged away into the night. Schools closed. Bread disappeared from shelves. Audrey had to learn to live with hunger, cold, and fear. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the air raid sirens, it was the look in her mother's eyes. The same mother who once insisted Audrey keep her back straight in ballet class now stooped low, gathering rotting potatoes from the black market. No longer preaching honor, just silent, carrying shame deep within. In November 1942, Audrey's uncle, Otto van Limburg-Stierum, was executed by the Nazis for joining the resistance. He was Ella's brother. The news arrived as a slip of paper pushed under the door. Ella didn't cry. She clenched her fists, stood in the kitchen all night. No cooking, no lights. The next morning, she quietly removed all Nazi symbols from their home. No explanation. Audrey couldn't fully understand, but she felt a collapse. Not of a government, but of a soul, a mother forced to rebuild herself from broken beliefs. Food grew scarce. Some days they survived on little more than boiled turnip water. In the winter of 1944, at war's peak, they ate tulip bulbs to stay alive. Audrey curled under a thin blanket, her ribs visible beneath her skin. She danced to stay warm, legs trembling not from the cold, but from hunger. And yet within that suffering, Audrey grew up fast. No more complaints, no distant dreams. Just one focus: survive. She learned to hear German boots from a distance. She saved breadcrumbs for village children. She read feelings in her mother's eyes, emotions Ella had never revealed before the war. One night by candlelight, Audrey asked, "Are you afraid?" Ella didn't answer. But then she took her daughter's hand for the first time and didn't let go all night. War does not spare childhood, but it leaves something else behind: strength. Not the loud kind, not defiant, but silent. like a mother who never knew how to hug, learning at last to hold a hand. Some wars are never written into history books, not because they were small, but because those who fought were too quiet to be remembered. Audrey never held a gun, never wore medals, but at 15 she was part of the resistance in her own way, as quiet and graceful as a ballet step. Velp had become a somber town. Winds swept through darkened houses. Midnight knocks on doors were no longer strange. Audrey continued to dance not for a stage, but to keep her body from freezing, to hide a fear she had never dared name. One evening, her mother received a whisper from a friend. Resistance fighters needed someone to deliver medicine and letters. No one could move safely during the day. German patrols were everywhere. And so Audrey was chosen. The reason was simple. She was small, quick, and no one would suspect a girl in a ballet dress holding a school book. Letters were hidden in her shoes, rolled inside socks. Sometimes they contained locations of wounded Allied pilots hiding in cellars. Sometimes hand-printed resistance newsletters. Audrey learned to walk without tripping, without trembling, without looking around. Each time she passed a checkpoint, she repeated to herself, "I'm just a girl going to school." But inside, she was no longer a child. Each night, she washed her feet in cold water, staring at the bloodied blisters, then slid her shoes back on by morning. Once a German soldier stopped her mid-walk. He stared at her long, then let her pass. Audrey never knew why. Perhaps there was something in her eyes, not innocence, but a calm so unshakable it gave pause. Audrey kept dancing. She performed in secret underground to raise money for the resistance. Her audience, hungry, ragged people, still clapped for each step, reminded them we are still human. Her mother once watched from a shadowed corner. No applause, no words. But that night, Ella polished Audrey's old ballet slippers and placed them gently on her desk. No explanation. But to Audrey, it was the highest praise she'd ever received. War turned a girl into a fighter, not with a gun, but with her feet. Every step on Velp's streets was a walk between life and death, between light and shadow. But she never looked back. And when the war ended, Audrey told no one. No diary, no boasts. She simply said, "I did what had to be done like so many others." Perhaps that was her most beautiful dance. A dance with no spotlight, no applause, just herself, and the quiet belief that even in silence, one can choose freedom. Audrey couldn't pinpoint when her mother began to change. But like all great transformations, it didn't happen in a day. It came like spring after a long winter, quietly, gradually, until the first bloom caught you by surprise. Ella van Heemstra, the woman who once shook hands with Hitler at a noble gathering, was now bent over scrubbing the floor, hiding a wounded British soldier in the old woodshed. That soldier, barely 20, had been injured during a failed Allied operation near Arnhem. German troops were raiding every house, every vegetable patch. Ella hid him in the shadows, wrapped his trembling legs in a thin blanket, boiled water over kindling gathered at the forest's edge. Audrey stood at the cellar door and saw her mother for the first time, not proud. She saw her bow her head. She saw those hands tremble, not from weakness, but from realizing she was finally doing something right. No one in town asked questions. In war, the one thing never betrayed was silence. Audrey didn't ask why her mother was doing this. But one evening, as they mended the young man's coat, Ella softly said, "There are things you can't undo, but you can begin again, if someone still dares to believe." It wasn't an apology, but to Audrey it was enough. From then on, their evenings weren't just about enduring. They laughed softly when a dish turned out too salty. They nodded with pride when Audrey stitched a seam just right, and Ella's gaze at long last no longer commanded but accompanied. Ella still didn't know how to hug, but she learned to rest her hand gently for a long moment on her daughter's shoulder. War faded toward the end of 1944, but peace didn't immediately follow. Instead came the brutal Dutch famine, the hunger winter. When bread vanished, hot water became a meal, and death waited quietly outside shuttered windows. During those days, Audrey fell ill. Her body weakened from starvation and cold. Every morning she woke up was a small victory. Every breath a gift. Ella never left her side. She traded her last silk scarf for turnips, walked miles for cough syrup, and when there was nothing left to burn, she dismantled the carved wooden doors of the old shed for firewood. Audrey saw it all. She didn't speak, but she remembered every detail. In spring 1945, when snow melted and Allied troops liberated the Netherlands, the young soldier hidden in their shed was carried away alive. At the doorstep, he bowed to Ella, eyes red with emotion. Ella didn't cry, but when she turned back inside, she trembled. Audrey stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her mother. For the first time, her mother was no longer the darkness, no longer cold, no longer proud. She was a woman who had wandered through delusion and returned human. And Audrey, who had lived in her shadow, saw a miracle a mother once thought lost coming back. Not to atone, but to love in the way she had just learned. When the war ended, Holland bloomed with flags. But within people, some things never returned to what they were. Audrey emerged from hunger and frost weighing under 90 pounds, her eyes sunken, her limbs shaking. Yet each time she stood trying to take a few steps in the living room, Ella sat up straighter, as if witnessing a miracle she once feared to hope for. They left Velp and moved to England by late 1945. They rented a room in a shabby London hotel. Ella worked as a cleaner, trading cold mornings for a few coins. The woman who once shook Hitler's hand, who once wore silk at aristocratic teas, now bowed to scrub tourist bathrooms. Ella never complained, never explained. But one night Audrey heard her mother cry. Not sobs, but a strangled sound like wind squeezing through winter cracks. Audrey entered the room, sat beside her silent. Each held a piece of silence, like two shards of broken glass unsure how to fit together. "I know everything," Audrey whispered. Ella looked up, not panicked, not denying. She didn't speak, just placed her wrinkled hand on Audrey's cheek. "Everything I believed was wrong," she said. It wasn't a defense, or even a confession, just truth raw, unvarnished. Ella never told the whole story, never spoke of that visit to Berlin, never explained the articles she once wrote praising the Nazis. And deep down, Audrey never wanted to know, because she feared if she heard it all, she might never again look at her mother with acceptance. Years later, Audrey said in an interview, "I believe in beginning again. Not because the past doesn't matter, but because someone had the courage to change quietly day by day." In that small room abroad, Ella made soup with onions and bone broth. Audrey resumed ballet practice slowly, step by step. When her war-injured feet swelled, her mother wrapped them in warm towels, silent apologies never spoken. Ella never said, "I'm sorry." Audrey never said, "I forgive you." They lived together in a different language, one where actions replaced words, and forgiveness was found not in voices, but in eyes and hands, in the act of opening the window to morning light. Sometimes the closest intimacy isn't in what's spoken, but in what two people choose never to say, so they can keep living beside each other without breaking. Ella lived many quiet years after that. She read books, brewed tea, waited for her daughter to return from auditions. She never went to Hollywood, never stepped into the spotlight. She chose to stay a shadow, not from shame, but because she knew her daughter needed to shine without carrying the past. When Audrey landed her first lead role in Roman Holiday, Ella sat at home, turned on the radio, and smiled. She didn't call, didn't send flowers. She simply took out an old photo, mother and daughter standing in Velp snow 1944, and placed it beside a small glass of wine. Ella never told that story, but Audrey remembered every word that had never been spoken, and perhaps that was enough. When Audrey appeared on screen in Roman Holiday, the world was enchanted. The girl with eyes that spoke, a figure delicate as moonlight, and a smile that seemed untouched by pain. The world fell in love instantly. The press called her the discovery of the century. Critics praised her as a new kind of woman, post-war elegance without pretense, irresistible in her simplicity. But no one knew when the film won the Oscar. Audrey stood backstage clutching a fabric necklace her mother had sewn from old curtains in Holland, the only item she kept from that time. The necklace didn't match her gown, held no pearls. But to Audrey, it was the thread between her light and the ruins she had never left behind. Ella didn't attend the ceremony. She stayed in Montreux, Switzerland. When Audrey's name was announced, Ella stood alone. No clapping, no tears, just eyes glowing as if her daughter's glow pierced through every layer of buried history. Audrey never let her mother walk the red carpet, not from shame, but fear. Fear that if someone dug too deep, the story would shift. The truth about Ella, a woman who once supported the Nazis, could shatter the perfect muse image Hollywood had painted. A reporter once asked Audrey about her childhood. She smiled. I grew up in Holland. There was wind tulips and many things that taught me to cherish peace. And that was all. No mention of hunger of corpses in the streets or of the photo in that drawer, her mother shaking Hitler's hand still tucked between greeting cards and a letter Audrey never sent. At every major event, Audrey called home. The calls were brief. Are you well? I'm fine. I'll visit soon. No talk of movies, scripts, gowns. They clung to something simpler no matter where the light shone. The thread between mother and daughter remained woven in silence. Ella followed Audrey like a loyal shadow. She didn't ask for defense, nor did Audrey offer one. Both understood some truths when spoken offered no release, only more distance. Audrey once said, I chose the light, but I never forgot the darkness that taught me to love it. Each film, each award, each praise of her kindness was another step forward on a path once buried in rubble, but she never let herself believe she had escaped the past. She simply learned to walk with it. Each night after the makeup came off, the jewels were tucked away. Audrey looked in the mirror. In that quiet space, no cameras, no applause, she saw a 15-year-old girl dancing in Dutch winter. And in the reflection faintly, the image of her mother, no longer the woman who stood on the wrong side of history, but the one who stayed in silence all her life. Light can heal, but sometimes only after the darkness stops hiding. In the bottom drawer of her nightstand, among yellowing handkerchiefs and an old love letter, Audrey kept an envelope with no name. Inside was a handwritten letter, neatly penned, undated. It began, there are things daughters never say to their mothers, not because they're afraid, but because they don't know if they'll be heard. She never sent it. Her mother never read it. Audrey wrote it on a cold night in 1961, just after finishing breakfast at Tiffany's. The world hailed her as an icon. Yet deep inside, one question remained. Did you ever truly see me, mother, when I was just a girl who needed to be held? In the letter, she recalled seeing the photo of her mother shaking Hitler's hand when she was 12. She didn't judge. But from that moment, a part of her heart closed a quiet room where disappointment lived untouched. She wrote, you once believed in a man history has condemned. I once believed in you. And for a time, those two beliefs collided, leaving a cut that never bled, but never quite healed. There were nights Audrey wanted to knock on her mother's door and ask why, but she never found the courage. Not for fear of anger, but of hearing, I don't know, and losing the last thread of faith she had left. Ella never asked if she had hurt her daughter. She cooked, tended, her grandson placed a hand on Audrey's shoulder whenever she came home weary. Her love was never spoken. It lived in small acts, switching off the light so Audrey could sleep, warming a glass of milk before bed. And Audrey never said she was hurting. But in the letter she wrote, each time you stroke Luca's hair, I feel envy. Not out of selfishness, but because I'm not sure you ever did that for me. The letter ended with a single line, I love you. But that love is like a song missing verses, not because the notes were forgotten, but because you never sang them with me. She folded the letter, placed it in its envelope, and tucked it away. Each year she would reread it, but never once did she send it. Ella died in the early 1980s on a quiet afternoon in Montreux. Audrey sat beside her, holding her hand. As her mother's breath slowed, she opened her eyes and smiled faintly. No last words, no hidden truths. Just a look gentle, carrying all they had never said aloud. After the funeral, Audrey returned to their old room. She opened the drawer, pulled out the letter, and nearly tore it in two. But instead she looked at it, then placed it in a photo frame beside a picture of them standing in Velp 1945. That was how she kept her mother. Not through the past or full forgiveness, but through acceptance that some things would never be spoken, and yet love could still exist quietly beneath all that silence. Forgiveness is an action, but for Audrey Hepburn it became a way of life. No one saw her cry at her mother's funeral. No one heard her speak long eulogies. She simply stood in a plain black dress, eyes gazing beyond the snow-covered Montreux peaks, as if speaking to someone she had shared 40 years of silence with. Ella left as she had lived quietly, without demands, without explanations. And Audrey remained with everything unspoken, still lingering in the air. She sorted through her mother's room. On the desk, a worn notebook. No confessions, no regrets. Just lists of simple tasks. Send birthday gift to Luca. Bake almond cake Saturday. Buy beige yarn for Audrey. Not history, just ordinary things. But it was those things that made her a mother, not the one Audrey had at 10, but the woman who had learned slowly how to love by doing. And Audrey, in her own late understanding as a daughter, finally saw it. When she accepted her role as UNICEF ambassador in the late 1980s, many were surprised. Why would a legendary actress step away from lights and luxury to walk into suffering? Audrey never explained. She traveled to Africa, Bangladesh, Ethiopia. She held emaciated children wipe sweat from dying mothers, lifted little girls weeping for lost homes. And in her eyes there was a gentleness, but also resolve, as if every act of kindness was part of something unfinished, something she'd never received for herself. People said she did it because she once starved during the war. And that was true. But perhaps there was another reason deeper, quieter. She was forgiving, not just war, not just her past, but her mother. Each time she stroked a child's hair, she did what Ella never did for her. Each smile she gave a grieving mother, she gave what she once craved. In every gesture, she rewrote her own past, not with words, but with the life she chose to live. Ella never said sorry. Audrey never said, "I forgive you," but in the way she lived quietly, kindly, faithfully, that was her highest act of forgiveness. Not every wound needs to be wrapped. Some must be carried like a part of ourselves, so we can love more deeply, understand more fully, and never repeat the pain we've known. Audrey never tore down the walls of silence between her and her mother, but she learned to live beside them, walk alongside them, and open doors to the world so that light could stream through the cracks softly without hurt. Forgiveness for her wasn't forgetting. It was accepting that even those who hurt us may have loved us in the only way they knew how. And sometimes that flawed love still deserves to be remembered. In the winter of 1992, Montreux lay beneath a soft blanket of snow. The small house by Lake Geneva stood quiet, like the final note of a long, gentle song. Audrey sat in the living room, a beige shawl around her shoulders. Outside, the lake mirrored the pale sky, and a life quietly closing. She knew her time was short. Cancer had come like a letter at the door, unhurried, wordless, but certain. Audrey didn't panic. She folded old letters, arranged photo albums, told her son to wear a scarf in Italy, to greet his grandparents, to read before bed. But there was one final thing she had to do. Audrey opened the old drawer where she had hidden the letter never sent to her mother. This time she didn't read it. She simply took it out, walked to the fireplace. The fire waited small, warm. She looked at the letter one last time, then fed it to the flames. No trembling hands, no regret. The paper caught, curled, turned to ash. And in the golden glow, Audrey smiled, the first true smile in days, as if she had finally shed a coat worn too long, too heavily for 40 years. She didn't need it anymore. Not the unsaid things, not the unspoken forgiveness. Because at some point we learn loving someone doesn't mean tearing them open for answers. It means holding their hand even without apology. Ella was gone, and Audrey would soon follow. But what remained was the simplest truth: they were mother and daughter. Not perfect, not ideal, but part of each other, like night and day, past and present, pain and renewal. When Audrey took her final breath, there were no tears, just wind whispering through the window. On the table, a steaming cup of tea. Beside it, an old photo, mother and daughter in a tulip field, both gazing in the same direction. Not toward the future, not toward fame, but toward something deeper: peace after the storm. Some say forgiveness is a gift we give to others. But Audrey proved it's also a gift we quietly give ourselves. And in that gift lived the silhouette of a mother, a past unforgiven, and a love that never needed to be named.